Good afternoon. Welcome to our DeHavilland discussion about this year's party conferences. We're going to be talking about how we can all make the best of them amid the slightly strange political circumstances we're all living through. I'm Rebecca Evans. I'm the Director of Content at DeHavilland, and I'm delighted to be joined this afternoon by two guests who not only have a wealth of public affairs experience, but who were also both special advisors to senior ministers in the Conservative government. So they'll be able to give us insight from both sides of the fence, as it were. So to introduce them, we have Chris White, who is Managing Director Public Affairs at Newington, and formerly was special advisor to William Hague, Andrew Lansley, and Patrick McLaughlin.
Hello.
Hello. And we have Paul Holmes, who is Head of Public Affairs at Clarion Housing, and formerly was special advisor to Damien Hines, Damien Green, and also Patrick McLaughlin. Welcome
Hello.
to you both.
Thank you.
So let's start first by talking a little bit about the politics. And I think the interesting thing for us is how this year's political party conferences might differ. So in a normal year, what might politicians be doing and indeed their advisors be doing to prepare for conference? What would they be seeking to get out of it?
So party conferences usually take months before they happen to plan, and all SPADs and all ministers will be clearing the messages that they want to get through with number 10. This number 10, seeing the way in which it's playing out, will be even more conscious of keeping that messaging on stream. We used to start speech prep 6 months before, go through various iterations. Number 10 will have to check those, diary slots. And what I'd kind of described, I've seen it from both sides. So I was special advisor to a party chairman during the 16 conference, as well as that one went. But we had to actually organise the key messages that wanted to be displayed during that time by the party and by number 10. And I often describe it as a mixture of, a SPAD is a mixture of the bodyguard versus, the thick of it. Because, I have been in the corridors of hotels going through secret documents because government continues. But I've also been on the other side, horizon scanning, just in case there's someone that the minister doesn't want to talk to.
Yeah.
So it's a long time planning. But this one will be slightly different, I think, in the politics, because number 10 and SPAD just simply do not know what's going to happen over the next few weeks. And so there'll be a bit of uncertainty, but those key messages and those key facts that government wants to get over to the public and companies and business will be thought of pretty
so that they'll have still had, in a way, the same time to prepare, even though we've seen a change of government. They'll have been thinking about it for a long while. But the main difference is not knowing what's going to happen afterwards. How does that change what they'll be seeking to get out of it? So there's an opportunity, as you've just described, to get a message out there. Will they also be seeking to receive information in, or is it very much about making sure the message is?
So predominantly, with a new Prime Minister, with a Prime Minister that I think still has some scepticism amongst the country, he will want to get over the kind of government that he's going to run, and this is an ideal opportunity to do that. But ironically, this number 10 and what we've seen actually has been more open, in my experience, than any number 10 I served in or any government I served in that they want to hear from business, they want to hear from the public about what policies and what measures the government can take to help business improve, but also and also the public. So I think it will be a mixture of both, to be honest with you, because if you will understand the domestic agenda of this government is fairly light at the moment. We'll probably see that elaborated during the Queen's speech. But businesses and public affairs companies or public affairs professionals do have, I think, quite a good opportunity to shape that public narrative and that debate coming up. And
is the conferences, but in particular the Conservative conference, one of the best ways to do that? In practice, what does that look like?
Well, I think the key message I would give to colleagues in the industry is that they should absolutely know the messages that they want to take. They should know very early on who they want to meet, and they should collaborate with their sectors. Because if various companies or various organisations go in and start asking for money, which is the old favourite thing, I work in housing, we're no stranger to asking for money, but if we go there if the industry goes there with a professional and concise ask of government, then I think that this is a unique opportunity. But if they go there asking for, funds, I don't think that will particularly get through.
And just to add to that, I think it's really interesting how you've got a new government coming in. It's looking for that traditional kind of partnership role, I think, particularly given it doesn't have a majority. So the more it can get sectors on side, the more it can present it as this is not something that's controversial. This is something that we can deliver together in partnership with the industry. So I think that's really, really important. But as you're right, whilst you've got this kind of, I think, I hesitate to call it the end of austerity, but that's the way it's being presented, perhaps a loosening of the purse strings. That's really kind of an interesting perspective to have, but it doesn't necessarily mean you can just go with your begging bowl to government and say, you know, I want X billions of pounds or millions of pounds for my favourite project without some trade-off of what does government get in return. You know, what are you in from your particular industry helping the government to deliver? And I think that's absolutely critical. And as Paul said, you can't do it on your own. You know, I think it's really important that you look to work together, whether it be with a trade body or with a group of businesses, and really present a united ask.
Yeah. And how accessible are ministers or their advisors likely to be at conference in practice?
I think one of the things actually depends on when the speech of the Secretary of State is, because I think I'll always remember I had a slightly weird role in that sense. I was cross-cutting across departments in the Whip's office and Leader's office, so I never really had apart from William in the last year, had a Secretary of State who had to give a speech. So I was wandering around sort of, you know, trying to get the messages and make sure they weren't making policy announcements or legislation that wasn't cleared. But special advisors and ministers are actually really hard to lock down or try and see until they've done their speech, and then actually you've got that sort of day and a half afterwards where they can try and cram everything in.
I agree with that. I mean, quite often party conference is seen as a bit of a holiday for MP staffers, but for special advisors, we genuinely spend most of our time in a locked temporary room going over documents, briefings and speeches ready, and Chris is right, depends when your speech is. So with Patrick McLaughlin, we had a speech at the very beginning.
Right.
For the rest of it, our diaries are a bit more mixed until he has to wrap up at the end. With Damien Green as first Secretary of State, although he spoke on the first day, it was a crucial speech because of where we were at that time supporting the Prime Minister just after the election. So we were locked away for quite a time planning that speech, and also at that point controlling negotiating and coordinating with other Secretaries of State about what they wanted to say.
Right,
we are not accessible as SPADs. In the evenings we probably are once we're off duty, but the ministers are more accessible than they would be outside of conference, but it's still quite disciplined.
Yeah, and the other thing to remember as well is that, you know, just because you are in Manchester or Birmingham in the case of the Tories and not in Westminster doesn't mean the business of government doesn't go on. There are still everyday cars that come up with red boxes that you kind of have to work through, you know, paperwork from cabinet committees, ministerial write rounds you have to respond to, and you know, SPADs and ministers will be going through all of these, whether you're the Secretary of State or the junior minister. So business doesn't stop.
And actually, given the unusual circumstances this year, do you think we're likely to see more of that, or how is it likely to be different this year, given the uncertainty of what might happen later?
I think it'll probably be the same. I mean, even though we don't know what, for example, the Supreme Court case is going to say, or what, what effect that might have, civil servants will still operate in a way in which ministers always operate. So they will be available from certain amounts of time. Red boxes will be delivered. They'll have to make decisions wherever they are. I remember a time when none of us could get signal in Manchester because it was in the conference centre, because it is absolutely dire. And as I say, standing in we were trying to get the European withdrawal bill at that time, a couple of clauses that we were responsible for, literally holding a phone in the air trying to get through to say what we wanted to happen. So Chris is right, the business of government will continue. And to be honest with you, I don't think that what's going on will make a difference in terms of workload. Okay. It may mean that some special decisions have to be made, or across the political scene, a conference may be slightly hijacked in terms of messaging depending on breaking news, such as what we saw when George Osborne made that speech in opposition when the economic figures came out and the crash happened. Something like that may happen, but the conference will continue and business of government continues.
Yeah. And in terms of what you were talking about in relation to speeches and then the time people have around that, I mean, we were looking at the main agenda for the Conservative Party conference that was published today, and looking at the fact that actually it looks like there'll be far fewer cabinet ministers giving speeches from the main stage. I think only 5 are down compared with, say, about 30 last year. Does that mean that actually the message control will be tighter, but the other ministers might be that bit more accessible if they're not all giving speeches in that way?
They may be more accessible. They may be slightly unhappy that they're not on stage giving a speech and having their time in the limelight, but they will be, let's face it, we know what this number 10 is like. Quite rightly, they are absolutely trying to get a message over in the very early days of Boris Johnson's government. Those ministers will be being watched by their SPADs and being kept on track by their SPADs. The SPADs know that they can't allow their ministers to say anything controversial. But your comment about 5 or 6 ministers speaking on stage absolutely will be about keeping those key messages. This is going to be a Brexit conference, I think, with a tinge of domestic policy and a little soupçon of what may come through afterwards, particularly with the Queen's speech. But I don't think you'll see a breaking of ranks with ministers that are not making speeches. They may be a bit more available to have some meetings with their key areas, but they're not expecting to be controversial.
I think that point about message control is really, really important as well, because I think it's not just about what's going on stage, it's also about what's going on Fringes. So I always remember, I think it was a 2011 conference when Ken Clarke started saying something at Manchester, I think it was, and it suddenly all the journalists in the lobby sort of latched onto it. I was standing in the middle and suddenly sort of started seeing lobby journalists running towards wherever this fringe was. And that sort of has the opportunity to, or rather the disadvantage of kind of knocking the message off course, because the whole point is Number 10 wants to put a message across, ministers are responsible for dealing with that. As soon as you start to roll the kind of the message off the straight and narrow, then you begin to lose control of the narrative, and it becomes, are the wheels coming off, what's happening, and from a journalist's point of view as well, you have to look at it from their point of view. They don't want to write what the standard line is. Their job is to find juicy and interesting snippets, stories, diary pieces, whatever. So the more that you can try and avoid that from a government message control point of view, the better.
But we were very equipped for that. So 2 years ago, and Chris is absolutely right, this does happen, I had a perfect day plan for my minister, for Damien Green, and dare I say, the current Prime Minister was a little bit of a sideshow at that time in that conference, and suddenly for the rest of the afternoon we were put out by Number 10 to defend the government's position against one of its own MPs. That can happen. You can suddenly find that you're deployed by Number 10. So that central element of control, even though we're outside of London, is still very much there. The Number 10 operation exists, and it's there on steroids during conference. But we plan for that, and conference continues.
And for people who are running or putting on fringe events, then, if we've got fewer ministers speaking from the stage, but actually there might be more eyes on the fringe events, are there ways to run that, to make the most of it?
I think one of the interesting points about this conference is it has a slight feeling of everything being thrown together at short notice, essentially because everybody thought probably until 2 or 3 weeks ago that we were going to have an election. So from that point of view, I think a lot of MPs' diaries, ministers' diaries are probably going to be a lot looser now than they perhaps might have been in previous years, and so that gives an opportunity to try and sort of put a few things in the last minute. But at the same time, ministers, MPs, backbenchers, junior ministers, PPSs, whatever, they're going to have that mindfulness of what is going on, because we are almost certainly going to have an election before the end of the year, possibly the start of next year, because the current parliamentary situation just can't continue, and therefore there will be a central view of, is what I am doing as in my position going to be helpful to the Conservative government at getting a majority or coming back with a majority after the next election. So I think if you are a public affairs professional, you're putting on a fringe, whether you're in-house, whether you're in an agency helping an in-house team put something together, you've got to answer that question. You've got to show why the value add works for government. Otherwise, it's not going to work.
Okay. And we'll obviously maybe we'll talk in a minute about what might happen after the conferences. But before we get to the Tories, we've obviously got Labour this weekend coming next week in Brighton. How much, if at all, does one party look at what the other party's doing in terms of the conference? Is it just head down, we're doing ours and we're doing ours, or is there some sort of, will the Labour be looking at what the Lib Dems did and the Conservatives be looking at what Labour do next week and thinking, oh, we'll tweak this or we'll tweak that around the message?
Having worked in CCHQ, I think I can safely say that we look a lot closer at Labour, particularly Labour conference, than many people think. So we will look every day at what's being announced there and possibly rebut things that are coming out. But in terms of key messages and how the conferences goes, there's an unwritten rule that no announcement will be made. Whether that's held this year, I'm really not sure, but with the way things are going, but no messages are put out during the other parties' party conferences. I think there will be, around Brexit, the governing party, the Conservatives, will be looking at what Jeremy Corbyn has to say, because if you look at even his announcements today, the government would argue that there's still that lack of clarity. He's still not coming out with a certain strategy of what he should do, particularly on Brexit. But on domestic policy, I think the Conservatives realise that there is, at the moment, a lack of domestic policy under this government, and they will be looking to do that very quickly. but Labour are slightly ahead of them. We might not agree with them, or that they might not be polling very well, but in some cases. But the Labour Party do have a bit more of an illustrated domestic programme, and the government will have to respond to that when the government's conferences start. But yeah, I mean they do, but I don't think it fundamentally changes.
How do you expect Labour to be thinking that they're going to make best use of their conference next week? What will they be planning to do? Get out of it, communicate?
Yeah, I mean, from their point of view, it's an opposition conference is always an easier one from the opposition leader's point of view, because essentially what you're doing is setting yourself in opposition to whatever the government's saying. So for them, it's a much easier one to kind of say, the government's terrible, we should be the government, there needs to be an election once we've secured a no-deal Brexit. So the message for them is much simpler than trying to craft, what will be the nature of the deal that happens on Brexit or on other domestic pieces of legislation that might be coming up in the Queen's speech in a few weeks' time. So, yeah, it's a lot easier for them. They'll be seeking to make the most of it. But, yeah, they've got...
In that sense, is it not that different from any other year for a party in opposition in terms of what they're trying to use the conference for?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably say it isn't much different. I mean, they've just got more, I guess, ammunition to use in the sense of there's a lot more disarray, there's a lot more uncertainty, and they can use that to their best advantage.
And they have the same problem that the Conservatives do. In fact, I think this is probably, except for the Liberal Democrats, this is the problem that every other party has in that they have to come up with a line and a policy position on the biggest issue of the day, which is Brexit. The Conservatives have a policy, but are slightly divided over that, they are divided over that policy. That's equally the same for the Labour Party. And therefore they will need to be coming out with a consistent message, and they won't want to see that their parties are divided. So really and truly, they're not going to act any differently to how they normally do.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit then about the Queen's speech. We've obviously got that really not much later in terms of how it's scheduled. What's the process, again, normally around preparing for a Queen's speech? And are there ways in which it might be different this year in these circumstances?
So, preparing for a Queen's speech doesn't start now. It started about 8 months ago.
Yeah.
So I always take an example. So when I was working for the Leader of the House back in, 2013, so in April 2013, we were finishing off the 2012-2013 Queen's speech. We were about to launch the Queen's speech in May, then the following month, for the sort of 20 bills of legislation. And then we were also had just written out to all the Cabinet Ministers asking for their bids for the final session of that 2010-2015 Parliament. So in a way, the government will already have locked down its slots. It knows what it wants in terms of legislation. It'll know the bills that it wants to do. Now that may have changed slightly from, though not, I would say, hugely, from the Theresa May administration to the Boris Johnson administration. It will also be reflective of the fact that we have this bizarre situation of having started the government with a majority with the DUP just to now not having a majority even with the DUP. So there might be some tweaking there around some of the mechanisms, but around whether certain bills come forward or not. But that will then be a decision of actually what is this Queen's speech for? Is it a Queen's speech to govern and to legislate and to pass acts? Or is it a Queen's speech which is actually more on an election footing and saying, this is what we want to do, I dare you to vote down, some what we view as from a Conservative point of view, a populist set of policies and bills. It might be on knife crime, it might be on, home building, it might be on, who knows what it might be on, but it'll be sort of what I would call more sort of red meat for an election.
But it comes down more to that, I dare you to vote it down, rather than because obviously
they don't have a
wouldn't
majority.
normally walk into the situation where it might get voted down in the same way.
So I think the last time that a Queen's speech, there's only been 3 times in what I would say modern British political history that a Queen's speech has been lost or been voted down. That was, I think, something like 1888, 1898 and 1923 from memory. So I'm a student of political history. Somebody can challenge me later on Twitter if I'm wrong. But it's been 3 times and it hasn't happened in the last 90 years. And that's going to be interesting because also we now have the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which has codified what is a vote of confidence. So whilst the government can say this is a vote of confidence, it could also turn around and say actually this isn't, because you need to pass a vote of confidence which says that this House has no confidence in Her Majesty's government, which is stipulated under the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. So you could see if the Johnson administration did want to, it could limp on for as long as it wanted to until the House turned around and said we pass a vote of no confidence in you. I don't think that's very likely because you've also got the rather big elephant in the room of what happens with the letter that's supposed to go to the EU on the 19th of October, which is mandated in the Ben Burt Act. And I think really that's going to overshadow what happens in the Queen's speech, because that's going to come slap bang in the middle. You've got the EU Council on the 17th, 18th, and the letter's supposed to go on the 19th, and the end of the Queen's speech is supposed to be on the 21st and 22nd. So you could have, I mean, again, I'm in hypotheticals here, but you could have a situation where the government starts the Queen's speech, the Prime Minister goes off to the European Council, either comes back with a deal, in which case all's nice and dandy, or you don't come back with a deal, and then the PM has to make a decision over whether he's sending an extension letter or not. And if he does, he's arguably broken a promise that he's made. If he doesn't, he could resign and let another Prime Minister make that decision. And then who then is the Prime Minister? What happens to the Queen's speech? All of these things are up in the air.
All up in the air, yeah. And for the Queen's speech at this stage, is there still an opportunity for public affairs professionals or others to influence any of the thinking behind it, or is actually...
I mean, I think at this stage the mechanism, so what I would call the vehicles in the queue, or the different bills in the Queen's speech are locked down. They'll already be there.
As in which ones?
Yeah. So you're going to have a Home Affairs bill, you might have a Justice bill, and so on. What's in the content of those bills might be more up for negotiation. So individual measures or clauses. Remember, bills can be small, medium, large. You can add things in during the passage. So there's still opportunities there to kind of speak to Secretaries of State and Ministers, to SPADs, and sort of find out what potentially might be in the Queen's speech. You might not get an answer, but you might get a hypothetical answer saying, if we were to have a Queen's speech, we might get this. And then it's about a question of saying, well, and how can we help deliver that? How can we help you share the burden of what you're doing, and perhaps give you a bit of good news to announce as well.
And what about the manifestos? We're certainly starting to get a lot of questions around the manifesto. What's the process? Who's doing it for the different parties? How might it differ this year? Can we influence? Who should we talk to? I mean, there's a lot of questions, obviously, and of course, what happens in the next few weeks will play into that as well. Where should people start thinking about this?
Well, I'll declare an interest in that. I came from, obviously, under the May administration through 2017, when no cabinet minister was shown the manifesto, let alone draft it. So I think it will be different this time. As I said at the beginning,
it won't be two people locked in a room.
It won't be. Well, hopefully, fingers crossed. But I don't think it will be two people locked in a room. As I say, actually, this number 10 has been quite open in allowing companies to come in, or business or sectors to come in and ask what they want. And normally the answer is we will look at that. Manifesto, obviously, I hate to keep saying key messages, but key drives at what Boris wants to be known as, particularly when we get to that vote for this Queen's speech or not. There will be a similarity between those two things, between the manifesto and the Queen's speech. It will have started, but I think historically, particularly in modern times, when I mean modern from 2010 upwards, there will be much more of an opportunity, I think, for sectors to have an influence on what is happening in that manifesto. Partly because ministers are still new. My Secretary of State in my sector, MHCLG, has been in post for a couple of months. So he will need, he will acknowledge that the sectors need to help him draft that policy. Historically, it will be quite an open process, which I think will go on right up until quite late in the day if we have an election in November, December. Yeah,
and I think it's very much about refining those policies. So the Secretary of States will already have an idea in their minds of what they want to achieve, but it's about how do you have meat to the bones of the policy, how do you make it realistic?
How do you make it work?
How do you make it work, exactly. Though, I mean, just to put a fly into the ointment, I did see a report a few weeks back, which I thought was quite an interesting one, of posing the question, will there even be a manifesto this time?
Okay.
Are we, is there a point of actually, because the main kind of policy of the day is what on earth is going to happen with Brexit, is it just simply going to be a one-issue election? Going back to the sort of coupon elections of the 1920s, where you, and again, I'm going on too much on history here, but you sort of had a single-issue campaign where people sort of had a little coupon saying, this is, are you on side or are you not? So you could theoretically, if there's a really snap election, if there isn't time to flesh out everything that's going on, just some number 10 saying, actually, do you know what? We're just going to have 3 or 4 things which we're going to absolutely major on. I mean, I don't know how realistic that is. I still think there is a deep-rooted feeling that there must still be a manifesto, but then you've also got, as effectively as Chief of Staff to Dominic Cummings, as someone who completely tears up the rule book on everything that he does. So who knows?
So in that sense, it's potentially more risky to have one because someone could then ignore it, or it's just less likely to happen in the first place.
Well, I mean, the thing about not having a manifesto is that if you do win a majority, and obviously for either side, winning a majority is is going to be a steep uphill task. But it does mean that you have that protection under the Salisbury Convention, which allows you to say this was in a manifesto, you pass it through the Commons, and therefore the Lords should respect the Salisbury Convention, which says that if something's in a manifesto and it's then in legislation, that they should then allow it through and amend rather than obstruct. So if you don't then have a manifesto, then effectively you're just daring the Lords to kind of play a bit of a game and sort of block things. So my bet, I've seen that said, it's worth throwing out there just as a thought, but I'm still betting that there will be a manifesto.
And what about on the Labour side? Have you got a sense of where they are at in the manifesto drafting process, and again whether people have an opportunity to influence?
So, as working in a sector and in an in-house role, we found the Labour Party particularly open at listening to some ideas. We have some tweaks that we want to existing legislation. We want to.
Who are you? And what kind of person are you talking to, or who are you talking to? What's the process there around here?
So we have a lot of so naturally being a social housing provider, we have a lot of Labour MPs who have our stock in their constituencies. We work with them to make sure that we have the best stock, and we work on their behalf and for their constituents. But the people that we talk to at the top of the Labour Party is no different from a governing party. The shadow cabinet and shadow housing ministers will have a responsibility for their brief and making policy announcements, and they will also have their advisors too. So as an organisation, we accept what government is in position at the time, and we focus on making the best out of the policies that they announce. But we absolutely treat all parties the same. We know that if there is an election, we don't know who's going to form the government, and so therefore it's a parallel process with just a different emphasis.
But I guess what I'm getting at is that they are both the two main parties are still in the process around being open to talking, having conversations.
Yes, absolutely. And you've seen it more clearly with the Labour Party, where, for example, they've announced a National Youth Service consultation or their social housing consultation. So we actively play a part in responding to those. Government can't do that. They can have government consultations, obviously, which as a large housing provider we respond to. But I think there is much more of a likelihood that a response from a large-scale organisation or a sector like ours would have an impact on an opposition party's policy just because of where they are.
The other thing to add in, I think that whilst you're right that there's a lot of sort of what I would call official consultations going on from the official opposition in terms of what is our policy, help us develop it. There's also a kind of parallel process going on by sort of pressure groups from within the kind of sort of what I would call the left wing of the Labour Party. So people like We Own It, for example, looking at what public infrastructure should, or the future of public infrastructure and public ownership should look like. What should nationalisation look like? All of these things are being done in parallel, and then the influence of those kind of groups on the Labour leadership or on the shadow teams is not, you shouldn't underestimate that at all, because I think there's kind of what's the official party policy is being developed, and then at the same time what Labour members want, and this Labour government. This Labour opposition, could be government, is much more driven, I think, by policy driven from membership than I think it has been in decades.
So understanding how that maps out and having conversations with all the groups as well as via the more well-trodden channels is important.
We have had a lot of interest recently from clients coming to us and sort of saying, how does the Labour Party policy process work? Can you explain how it happens? What's not just the official process, but what's also going on in the Labour Party sort of wider ether of sort of reports being drawn up and understanding what's going on. So I think from that point of view, it's fascinating to see how organically policies are being sort of refined as they go through the official party policy. It's not just the shadow team, or perhaps as it would happen, I think, more traditionally in the Conservative Party, where it's the shadow ministerial team in consultation with CRD and the MPs, where this you've almost got an extra layer, or almost Lib Dem-like of like consulting with the members and actually getting much more of a bottom-up process, which has almost, I think, completely died out in the Conservative Party. You know, Conservative Party sort of policy forum, I think, is almost non-existent now.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, a specific example on that in housing, we work with a lot of local authorities. Momentum are quite strong in various parts of London where we have quite a lot of stock. And historically, this Labour opposition, or at least an important part of the Labour Party machine, i.e. its membership, have more of a scepticism about the role of housing associations than the Labour Party historically. You know, they believe, which they're entitled to, that council housing must be social housing must be council housing, and that housing associations are businesses. So we have had to take that into account and change the way in which we work with local authorities and yet some housing ministers and MPs where our stock is, to show them that actually we're not businesses. We are, we invest every piece of surplus that we have back into delivering that social housing.
So it's adapting to some of those more either ideological or people's position or understanding.
Showing them, showing people, and particularly some of the London boroughs, showing them that, you know, the housing that we are providing is no different to council housing. It's just, you know, that actually we are separate from a local authority.
Okay, well, we're nearly out of time. I just wanted to ask you both if there's sort of one thing that you'll be looking for as a signal from either one of the two conferences that we've still got to come, just to put you on the spot. What will you be keeping an eye to see? Does it happen or doesn't it happen? Or
he's putting me on the spot.
Some clarity from what I'm looking for, and what Clarion Housing is looking for, is some clarity on what the Conservative government, this government, thinks about the role of social housing. Spoken a lot about ownership. We want to see a bit more about social housing.
Okay, so it's around specifics around policy.
I mean, for me, because I work in an agency, it's much more broad brush. We've got clients in different sectors, so there'll be different things, whether it's on the future of public-private partnerships, for example, and how that works, because there's a review going on and we don't yet know how that works. How does that then chime in with what the Labour Party want to do? In financial services, for example, what's happening in, once the UK leaves Brexit, or, you know, after Brexit, what happens next? Will we get a signal of what the government's intention on regulation of financial services looks like?
So there's signals, there's actually being clear about policy, there's signals about what might happen next.
And this is the thing, I think one of the challenges, I think, for a lot of public affairs professionals at the moment is because the government has been hamstrung for such a long time on domestic policy in terms of not bringing anything through where it is simply just either motherhood and apple pie or something that everybody agrees with and therefore nobody's particularly concerned about. Is, you know, what is going to happen on all of those post-Brexit things that have been parked for such a long time? Where's the clarity? What do parties want to achieve? So, you know, the traditional questions that Paul's talking about around how do you increase housing supply? You know, and I think unless we can get the information out of government, or at least get some, and the opposition as well, and even from the Liberal Democrats and other parties, I think it's going to be, we can't just let conferences just be about Brexit. It has to be more than that.
Okay.
I'm looking for them to still happen as well. That's another thing. Well,
let's hope so.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you both very much for joining me. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it useful. If you are going to conference, then please do come and say hello to me and my colleagues if you see us there. And thanks again.